At Black Nerds Create, we love all things fandom and creation, and we especially love fantasy. That's why we're excited for our newly named Black Magical History Month coming in February. Black Magical History Month is our 6th annual celebration of Black stories, characters, and fans across different fantasy media. Get ready for a month of digital events, challenges, and community turn-ups all across social media. To stay up to date and get more information, go to blacknerdscreate.com.
I'm Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you're listening to Hard NOC Life.
Well, it's the NOC in full color, you see me? The Hard NOC Life, comics, movies, and TV, yeah. Pop culture with a different perspective.
Welcome to Hard NOC Life. I'm Keith Chow.
I'm Britney Monet.
Hi, I'm Dominic Ma.
The whole gang is back.
It's good
Pod
to see you.
came back
friends.
last week, but the gang is back this week. Welcome back, everybody.
Yes.
Good to see you.
I missed y'all.
How was everyone's hiatus? It took us a while to get to the hiatus, but
Yeah, mine was good. I finished a squat challenge that I was doing, and now I'm almost about to finish a crunch challenge. So that's
nice.
fun.
So you
Yeah.
keep it healthy. Good for you.
Trying
At least
to.
one of us is healthy.
I don't know. Does my face finally look slimming down?
You
'Cause I've
look
been working
great.
out a
As
lot,
always,
so
Brittany. You look
I'm
wonderful.
trying. Thank you.
Dominic, how was your break?
It's fine, rainy. Rewatched The Wire, as one does. I did not do any physical health stuff, which one should do when you're on a hiatus from the screens and stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I was also sick through most of it, so I'm
Yeah.
finally feeling better. So no one tuned in to the podcast to hear about our individual health challenges, but they did tune into this podcast about, particularly this week, the biggest news to discuss maybe ever on the podcast. I don't know. That's maybe hyperbole. I mean, you know, I'm a DC head.
Hyperbole it up, buddy.
Yeah. Well, it's the Super Bowl next week, so.
Yeah, this is the
Oh,
hyperbole.
Rihanna.
This is the Hyper Bowl. Next week it's the Super Bowl. Some cool trailers coming from the Super Bowl next week. Did you?
Oh, right. Yeah, it'll be
There's
trailer
the
for that.
Flash trailer. We're gonna that movie's actually coming out apparently, so we'll see some footage from the Flash. But speaking of the Flash and his home at DC Studios, we now have a slate of films and television series
Mhm.
announced by the man himself, James Gunn. And when you know it, we have a special guest on the podcast. Someone who was in the room where it happened. He was sitting there inches from James Gunn and Peter Safran when they delivered their slate of upcoming DC projects. Please welcome to Hard NOC Life, staff writer at the Nerds of Color, Mike Manalo.
Hey everyone, hey Keith, hey Brittany, hey Dominic, and everyone
Hi, Mike.
listening. Thank you guys for having me on this. I'm really excited to dive in. So yeah, really grateful for this.
Well, we got to talk to you because Dominic, Brittany, and I have been wondering about what the hell DC is going to look like going into the future. James Gunn finally announced their plans. Chapter 1 of DCU is called Gods and Monsters. We're getting 5. Well, so far, there's going to be more to the slate, but they announced 5 streaming series, 5 films. And the 4 movies that are coming out in 2023 are going to tie into or lead into this new chapter of the DC cinematic universe. So
Conveniently.
well, so let's start with that. Let's start with the immediate, because I mentioned the Super Bowl is going to give us the first real footage of the Flash, which Gunn and Safran seem to be high on still. Like,
Yeah, he said he liked it, right? If Gunn said he liked the Flash movie. Yeah.
He really was excited for it. The vibes coming from Gunn, Gunn always comes off very sincere. So it's hard to tell whether or not it is PR or whether it is Gunn, but it seemed legit that he said it was one of the most effing greatest superhero movies.
you can cuss on this podcast, Mike. I don't know if
Okay.
you cuss generally, but you can say fuck.
He said it's one of the fucking greatest superhero movies he's ever seen.
We are a
And it was-
podcast that fucks. Don't worry. Speaking of fucking, right? Like, what's also interesting about this slate is that it's also going to embrace PG-13 and R ratings across the board. But let's think about, so one of the burning questions that we've had at the Nerds of Color is how would the DCEU morph into the DCU, right? Like, we've talked about, first of all, they've rebooted the DC universe, the cinematic universe, multiple times just in the last few years already.
Yes.
And now we have, Shazam's coming out in a couple weeks, and there's a whole shitload to talk about Shazam, unfortunately. After that, leading into yet another problematic lead actor for a DC film, The Flash. And that, he says, James Gunn says, will reset the universe, which will then lead into Blue Beetle, and that will lead into Aquaman. Weirdly, Aquaman 2 is part of the reset DC universe. So, Mike, let me ask you, since, again, you were in the room and perhaps there was some body language or some things in the ether that didn't come out in all the press reports. Did they dig into, or did someone ask about how exactly is the current iteration of DC universe morphing into this new version, particularly with, you know, Flashpoint seems to like be the makes the most sense to be the reset, but at the same time it's kind of leading into a sequel to a film that's part of the original version of the universe. Like, did he talk at all more deeply that maybe wasn't, you know, again, addressed in the press reports about how exactly the DCEU becomes the DCU?
So I will say this: no one directly asked the question.
What kind of journalists were in the room, man?
I know those bastards. No, I for me, anyways, the way that I interpreted what he was saying and the way that I got it was that Flash was really going to be that Flashpoint, right? Like, it's going to the way that Flashpoint reset everything into the New 52. This was going to be sort of a New 52 of sorts. And in the New 52, when you think about it, Batman kind of continued. The continuity of Batman sort of remained intact, but then a lot of other things ended
which
up
didn't make any sense at the time, but we won't dive into my problems with the New 52. How the fuck do you have 5 Robins, but you only been Batman for like 8 years? But anyway, go ahead.
But I guess it's going to be very similar. Flash is going to do that. And while they weren't ready to answer the specific question, they said some of the old, stars that we knew and we loved about the DCEU would be staying. Some of them would be going. And famously, we know for a fact that Affleck and Cavill are definitely no longer part of it. I think from what I understand, there's still talk and question about whether Godot, Miller, and, Momoa's in, I think. But what Momoa is going to be playing, they emphasize it's not going to be 2 roles, and they weren't privy to whether it would be Aquaman or Lobo or something else. But my suspicion is going to be Lobo, even though they didn't actually explicitly say it.
Didn't Peter Safran say, I thought I read a quote, maybe it was in your piece, that they envision Aquaman as a trilogy? So, like, there's still an Aquaman 3 on the horizon?
They did envision Aquaman as a trilogy, that's correct. But they didn't explicitly say, whether or not it was going to be part of this Momoa trilogy or anything. We don't know anything really about the Aquaman in the Lost City, in the sense that it might be one of those standalone movies that, from a timeline perspective, takes place before Flashpoint, right? That could be very possible. And then Flashpoint resets everything from there.
Yeah.
So we don't really know. But we do know that a couple of people are sticking around for sure. Momoa to some capacity. Viola Davis, most definitely. She's got her own series. And most definitely, Safran let it slip that Cena is sticking around as Peacemaker as well. So those are the 3 that have absolutely been confirmed. But everything else is still very much up in flux. And the 2 that are confirmed to be out, Cavill and Affleck, as far as portraying Batman and Superman are concerned. So my guess is it's going to be a mix. Some things from the DCEU sticking around and some things being hard rebooted. Whatever Flashpoint is going to do is going to hard reboot those things.
And it's interesting, too, like Dominic and Brittany, we've talked a lot about Peacemaker on this podcast. And one of the questions that was kind of out there was, James Gunn is heavily involved with Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. How would they stick around after they reset the universe? How could it be if those were like firmly in the DCEU? But what's interesting, if you flash back to the finale of season 1, when we see the Justice League, and that was like, oh, this is part of the DCEU. You notice that we only really see Aquaman and Flash. Like Ezra Miller, Jason Momoa are the only 2 actual physical actors on set. Wonder Woman's in shadow, Superman's in shadow. So in a sense, if they are the Flash and Aquaman of the DCU, you could say Peacemaker really wasn't part of the DCEU as we knew it and was kind of this new version of the DC universe. I mean, I'd said this to Lauren last week when we talked about, interestingly about Star Wars, but like continuity is like a nerd's game anyway. Like most people don't give a shit about continuity. But that said, like, how do you 2 feel about, I know that like Dominic in particular doesn't have a lot of love for the current DC, cinematic continuity, but like just in general, all the things we've talked about over the last couple of years, like what do you think of this initial announcement about how these 4 movies in 2023 lead to this rebirth, pardon the pun, of the DC universe.
I mean, I think in a way I'm for it because there are certain things that Snyder, I've never fully liked Snyder. I know it works for some people, it just didn't work for me. I do think the one thing Snyder did well was casting, Henry Cavill and Ben Affleck. So it's kind of sad that those are the two that were like losing in this new universe. But I don't know, I'm kind of excited to see what James Gunn is going to do because I really did like the Suicide Squad and obviously I really loved Peacemaker, so I'm excited for what's going to happen, but also at the same time I'm kind of just like, I don't know, I feel bad that certain people aren't coming back. That's how I feel about it.
Can I just add some things for context for perhaps the non-super comics nerds who are listening? Because Keith, for one thing, I agree with you, this is the biggest DC news to hit the universe since, I don't know, that time there was announced there would be a Cyborg movie at that time. So I'll put everything flip back to the context of, yes, we've had this moment before.
Absolutely.
Slates get announced. It is not necessarily going to relate to movies that actually come out.
For sure. This Flash movie that's coming out, air quotes, in June was supposed to come out 5 years ago for one example. Right.
That said, it is good to have a plan. We appreciate having a plan, and it gives us nerds something to look forward to. Specifically, as far as Flashpoint, we remember, for you non-comics nerds, that is the one where Flash runs around the multiverse and creates many alternate timelines, which very conveniently, enables multiversal things to happen. I think at one point in the podcast, I was thinking, I think it's totally cool if they have what's his face, Pattinson Batman just being Batman in just sort of, a side alley of what we're gonna say is the main DCU with Gunn and Safran. It's totally cool if there are two Batmans. It's totally cool if that one Batman universe is just on its own path. Marvel paved that ground, and and so even further to relate to the Momoa thing. Momoa, if you're listening, I'm just as far as the two characters that people want you to play, por qué no los dos, dude? The one thing we really could have is you could be Aquaman and Lobo
in the same
two
movie.
Different sectors,
or in the same movie, for God's sake.
Of this wild universe. Yeah.
I would love to see Jason Momoa act against Jason Momoa. I
realize that's unlikely. I'm just saying it because we've opened up the multiverse Pandora box. Don't believe anything that they say in this, or don't adapt when it changes, because it's going to change. And B, we should embrace the versatility of the possibilities now that we're not locked into the one Batman anymore. That is so 2012. We can have.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Pattinson, because Mike, another thing that came out before we get into the slate, the other thing that came out, in terms of confusion and how do the universes work together, is that they firmly established there will be a DC Elseworlds kind of imprint, if you will, for films that exist outside the current DC universe continuity, and that it includes Matt Reeves' Batman, it includes Todd Phillips' Joker, for some reason he kept bringing up Teen Titans Go, which as a Teen Titans Go fan, absolutely love that they're basically committing to keeping the show going. But it's I don't think anyone was wondering if the Teen Titans Go was going to be part of the universe or not. But well,
it's an interesting problem because of the video games thing. But I'll circle back.
Well, that's I do want to talk about, and that's where my conversation with Lauren kind of went last week. But so the Elseworld stuff is happening. I know, Brittany, you wanted Pattinson to be the Batman in this universe, but Mike, what did they say about the Elseworld stuff and what we can look forward to as far as continuing to make things outside the, I know he doesn't want to call it the Gunverse, but we'll just use that as a shorthand for now, the current DCU.
Sure. So really, Matt Reeves is going to be finishing what they called the Batman crime saga, for sure. And that's not going to have any effect at all into what the main storyline of the DC universe is really going to be. And I think that that's great, because we're still going to get the Penguin series. We're still going to get the Batman Part 2, as it's officially called. And
Colin Farrell even confirmed in an interview with Variety this week that the Penguin series is about to start shooting in a couple weeks, and it'll be 8 episodes.
Yep.
And apparently Robert Pattinson was in New York. But Robert Pattinson was apparently in New York recently. So
the plot thickens.
But that's still going to keep going, and most likely Reeves is going to at least have one more Batman film after Part 2. So that's going to be great. I know Superman and Lois is still going to continue. That is definitely an Elseworlds thing now. And the Todd Phillips Joker movie, Joker Folie à Deux, is definitely going to continue and exist as Elseworlds. The one thing that Gunn was adamant about, that I don't know if the trades really reported on this specifically, but he really did emphasize, or at least that I caught, that something would really have to come along to have like this really great story for them to also do another Elseworlds movie outside of what's already being done right now. So I think, it to help them kind of concentrate on this single story, they're not necessarily, just taking any Elseworlds story that's coming in, on their plate right now. But if it's really good and if it's really worthwhile, I think they would pursue it. But that being said, I actually love the idea that you can pursue Elseworlds, that they're introducing the idea of Elseworlds to fans that don't read the comics as much, because as someone that goes to the comic book shop every Wednesday, it's great to see a Batman book that's not part of the main continuity, like I don't know, Batman the Winding Year or something like that, different takes from different authors, and to have that on the films as well allows more creativity and more direction from any filmmaker coming in and putting their spin on the character. So I love that, and making that clear demarcation between Elseworlds and the main continuity is something that I think Marvel's kind of stumbled at, since their inception. So that might be, it really is a good step forward for DC, So
let's dig into it. Let's dig into the actual slate that we're getting. So after, discussing how this year's crop of films will continue to come out, I know there was some concern, like, they canceled Batgirl and all that stuff. Like, were they going to cancel like these movies? Is the Flash going to come? Those movies are all coming out. And then it's going to lead directly into the beginning of the DC universe, which I'm assuming they didn't give any, other than Superman, they didn't give any release dates. So, but I'm assuming these are all going to kick off in 2024. And the first project they announced was an animated series. And this is what really kind of like took me back. I don't know how the room reacted, Mike, but you kind of build up, and then like the first thing out of his mouth is Creature Commandos. The animated series.
Like, who?
See, that's a test.
Yeah.
That's a test if you dig the same weird parts of the comic universe that James Gunn honestly does. Yeah.
Or if you're that in tune with the obscure knowledge of DC's history,
I'm a professed DC head.
Mm-hmm.
I had no fucking idea who the fuck the Creature Commandos were when I read Mike's draft, because full disclosure, Mike drafted the article like the night before embargo, right? So I was like reading this shit at like 2 a.m. like, the fuck is the Creature Commandos?
Well, wait, as far as I remember, it's like the Guardians of the Galaxy thing. The Creature Commandos are a thing I've heard of, but he made his own, cast of them, which not like the iconic creatures. So
the kind of like, background research I did after finding out about this is the one project that's kicking off the whole fucking thing is, yes, they were a team of universal monsters essentially assembled to fight the Nazis back during World War II. I'm assuming this is not what Creature Commandos is going to be about for the launch of the DC universe. And I'm assuming the art piece that they showed is from the show itself. So like, along with all of the announcements, they actually released comic book art, which we were going to dig into, like, what does it mean? Like, why they use particular like images from the comics. But the Creature Commandos art is actually lifted from the show, right? That's probably the first official footage from any kind of DCU project we got was Creature Commandos, right?
That's correct. Yes. This is from the show. This is from the animation company that's doing it.
And the big kind of like the big news, I guess, of this is that what's going to set the DCU apart from previous incarnations of the DC universe in movies, in live action or whatever, is that it's not going to be just live action. As they announced this animated series is the first thing. They're going to tie together animated series, live action, TV, film, and video games. I'm wary about this. We've talked about in Star Wars how difficult it is to keep track of all of the continuity, and people, Dave Filoni gets in trouble because like he contradicts things from the books. Do you guys share any concerns that trying to herd all of the cats in all the different kinds of media to tell a single story? Even Marvel can't do that. Marvel's struggles came when they started incorporating streaming series, right? Now imagine Marvel was like the video games and the cartoons count too. Star Wars is probably the one place where like they've tried that approach, and it's, various forms of success, Fallen Jedi and whatever. tying into the, continuity or whatever. So like, where are we on this whole unified theory of all mediums telling one story?
I think Star Wars is totally cohesive, but that's because
well, that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
I feel like the current books that I do read are the ones that are actually like part of the Disney film, Lucasfilm, like story group. So it's like they do have to run by things by like the film and TV live action thing before they do something. So it's a little different with those set of books. I didn't read the like, what is it called? The like extended or the older books.
Right.
I didn't read those
stuff and stuff.
Yeah, the legend stuff. So I don't know anything about terms of Dave Filoni. I think that's when people are complaining is when he is.
No, but he apparently Tales of the Jedi apparently contradicted something from the Ahsoka book, and that's why like people were.
I haven't read that book yet, so that's on my list of.
But is I mean, so like,
you're segueing. I'm sorry,
Dominic. You're the lone gamer on the podcast. I'm not accounting for Mike. I mean the like regular cast of characters on this podcast. You're the lone gamer in that sense. Like, how difficult is it to incorporate video game? Like, again, Star Wars tries with like Battlefront and Fallen Jedi.
Oh yeah, no, that's the place in the media coverage where it got the most pushback, that exact comment. So, but wait, I'm going to say my opinion is that thing he said about unifying all across all media. I think he was kind of just saying that to appease the part of the fan base of DC movies that has rightly been going, well, it's just not as cohesive as Marvel. It's not as integrated as Marvel, and that's definitely true. So the connections between each movies, they aren't as fun to make because it seems loosey-goosey. And I mean, and I do believe that they will try to integrate, animation, TV shows, movies, and that's things. I have a suspicion he was just sort of umbrellaing video games, like in an ideal world. If that's actually a policy. So anyway, the media coverage where there's pushback because making video games is a different animal. And if you're like, oh, we have to have, for example, the A-list movie actor doing the voice for Superman because we have to have the same person doing Superman in every media, that puts on an unmanageable restriction. And of course would screw up the whole process because these are A-list movie stars now. And you have to work around their schedule and all that crap. Anyway, that was my thinking. I just don't think they're going to hold to that video game part.
Yeah, it seemed like he was fully serious about it, if I'm going to be honest. the reason that I said that was because he was really adamant that we weren't just going to have video game tie-ins, like Superman Legacy comes out and then the video game comes out of that fills in some gaps from the Superman movie. What he was really suggesting was any video game that comes out will likely come out between two of the really story-centric films, because the 5 films and the 5 shows that he introduced last Monday, that's only half of chapter 1. And supposedly some of these are really going to tie in really heavily to the main storyline and others very loosely. So my guess is if they do a video game and it ties into, Superman Legacy and Supergirl World of Tomorrow, it'll be like what was Crypto up to between the events of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'll play that game.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to add one more thing to that. The only reason this matters is because the Batman and Spider-Man games were some of the best narratives for those characters ever. Like there was we debate about the movies all the time, and I realized from it's not speaking to the you're not those into those games, but the Batman games beat the hell out of most Batman movies. The Spider-Man game beats the hell out of most Spider-Man movies. So why, if we have to make those adhere to the movies which are of varying quality, we're going ugh.
The PlayStation Spider-Man game is successful because it doesn't have to incorporate the movies into it. Yeah, the Arkham games are successful because they didn't have to be Christian Bale and whatever, right? Like they could be their own thing. And that's my same worry about, and it's not just video games. I think similarly, someone on Twitter asked James Gunn, because that's the other thing that sets James Gunn apart from every other like studio head is like he fully responds to people on Twitter. But they asked him like, DC over the last couple of years they've been varying degrees of success with their live action films, but they've created a core fan base of their animated films, over the last 10 years or so. And like there was a whole DCAU continuity, right? Like that sense ended, and now there's a bunch of like single story, you know, films coming out like Super Sons and Legion of Superheroes and all that stuff. And they asked him like, is the DCAU movies still going to happen? And Gunn said, yeah, we're still going to do them. But like, are they going to be now Elseworlds, or is he saying we're going to do animated movies that they have to now tie into them? Like, again, continuity is the domain of nerds, and I get like why folks have these conversations, but sometimes I do think continuity can also be oppressive, and having to adhere to like someone's story idea in this like whatever medium can sometimes just get in the way of a good story. And that's always what I thought. Marvel's figured out, like they're the only game that's figured that out. And even then it's varying degrees of success, right?
Yeah. And you know, I think to the point of the DC animated titles, you know, I honestly think that franchise has been going on forever. Like that the direct-to-video animated movies are all connected, right? My impression is that if those are still going to continue, they'll probably have to be Elseworlds for sure. And I don't think that there's any issue with something like that, because they can remain as is, and if people don't like what Gunn's cooking up, they can just watch those as they've done with the DCEU and these existing simultaneously. So yeah. I wouldn't necessarily say like every single thing that has been created in existence is connected, but just the stuff that they're working on that's getting created net new will probably be part of that story, unless that franchise already existed, like Superman and Lois, the Batman, or the DCAU titles. That's the impression that I got.
Guess what? Goalie Nutrition is sponsoring Hard NOC Life, and you can go to goalie.com to buy apple cider vinegar gummies, their ashwagandha gummies, superfruit gummies, and super greens gummies, and you get 10% off plus free shipping if you use the code HARDNOC at goalie.com. This is honestly, I've been taking the goalie gummies now for a couple weeks, and I have to say they're tasty and they're good for you. Have you guys been enjoying the goalie gummies?
I really like them. They're yummy, but it's a nice to add to my like routine of already like I normally take just straight vitamin C, so it's nice to have like extra supplements.
For a long time, people have praised the benefits of apple cider vinegar, and you know, as someone who's had to like drink straight apple cider vinegar sometimes when I'm not feeling well, or you know, I have some joint pain, and your mom was like, drink some apple cider vinegar. It's not the most appetizing home remedy, let's just say.
Right. It tastes horrible.
Like the apple cider part is like, ooh, does it taste like apple cider? It is like, no, it tastes like vinegar. But ACV is very good for you. And the fact that Goalie has been able to put the ACV into these tasty little gummies made with pectin and fruit peels, which make them vegan, which is cool. So if you're vegan, you can still rock these gummies, because everyone knows gummies are usually made out of like gelatin and nasty shit. These are made out of complete non-GMO, gelatin-free, gluten-free, vegan ingredients, and you can get the benefits, all of the benefits of apple cider vinegar, taking these tasty, delicious, convenient gummies. So go to goalie.com and use the code HARDNOC, that's HARDNOC, just like the podcast you're listening to. Get 10% off your purchase of Goalie products and free shipping.
It's a much better delivery device for that apple cider vinegar.
Yeah.
These Goalie gummies are great. You get it, and it's a delicious little candy. And I've been enjoying the Super Fruits one. I did feel kind of refreshed after taking a few of those.
Yeah, no, but I'm loving them so far, and they're definitely tasty. If you just want tasty gummies, at least just eat them for the yumminess.
Yeah. So go to goalie.com, use the code HARDNOC, HARDNOC, get 10% off your purchase and free shipping at goalie.com with the code HARDNOC. So let's run through some of the other announcements, because I do want to dig into them as much as possible. And I think, Mike, there's a particular order that all of these announcements came out in. He never said this is the order that they're going to actually physically come out in, right?
Not right now, no.
And again, he doesn't know. I'm sorry, I keep harping on this.
Warner Brothers.
No. There's the thing is, there's several projects that he announced here, like I said, that he mentioned will potentially tie into that main storyline. And if one of these gets delayed, the rest of them are going to shift. But then there's other stuff here that doesn't have that direct of an impact on that main storyline. Maybe some characters intersect, but it's not really going to be part of fleshing out that main narrative. That will come out whenever they need to come out, because they're not going to impact anything. So that's what he's hoping. That was one of my big questions.
The second project was Waller, which I think was a big surprise because everyone assumed that he was working on Peacemaker 2. But Waller, in a sense, is taking the place of Peacemaker 2 because he says this happens between 1 and 2 because he just didn't have time to work on Peacemaker 2.
Yes.
But this is essentially kind of like a sequel to Peacemaker because it's going to involve Viola Davis, which is interesting that, this was the first project that they announced outside of Creature Commandos, and they used the comic book art. And I was thinking, like, well, you already have images of Viola Davis as Waller. Why would you use the comic book art? Maybe the comic book art is kind of a hint as to what's inspiring the Waller series, but we have that, and that's a direct tie-in to the Peacemaker show. It's even going to have Peacemaker folks on it. It's being showrun by Christelle Henry, who worked on Watchmen, and Jeremy Carver, who created Doom Patrol. So that's already a pretty,
that sounds good.
That's a pretty elite tandem of showrunners. So what, just quick thoughts on the Waller show and with Viola Davis, the EGOT winner herself, leading the way.
I think she's one of the, one of the better castings that we got from the quote unquote Snyder part of the world. She's always great. And I don't know, I really like Doom Patrol, even though that got canceled, but I don't know. So it's been fun, I think, with Jeremy and everyone.
But do we think, this is always true, but I think it's become more true that they're echoing the model of the, Nick Fury, Samuel Jackson being sort of the, nexus point of the Marvel universe. And that worked really well in that he got to slowly gather people and bring the different characters together. And Waller has been doing that, and that is her natural function in the DC universe too. So as far as just, again, somewhat aping what the MCU has done with great success, I think that's a good part of the model to borrow.
Yeah, but I do also wonder, again, I know I keep harping on the continuity piece, but when you think of, to Brittany's point, you have some casting that crosses over from the original iteration of these characters into this new version, Viola Davis being one of them. It's interesting that aside from The Suicide Squad, which was James Gunn's movie, the other projects that she was a part of, namely Suicide Squad 1 and Black Adam, are kind of like the redheaded stepchildren of the original DCEU. And it's is her assembling that first iteration of the Suicide Squad and the Justice Society, is that really what she did? Because are we supposed to just kind of neuralize or forget it like Men in Black, and that the only team she's assembled is the Peacemaker team? You know what I mean?
Well, she does black op government stuff, dude. This is all above
selective
our pay grade.
amnesia.
This continuity stuff is
yeah. And Gunn did mention that some events would seem like faint memories.
Mm-hmm.
He used that term specifically.
That's always tough.
Did the events happen and then Flashpoint resets it and people just vaguely remember it?
Because and this leads into the big daddy of them all. The next project that he announced is, again, I think one of the issues with the whole DCU slate announcement is that James Gunn was on Twitter kind of talking about all this shit for months before they came out with it, right? That big Hollywood Reporter story about all the machinations happening behind the scenes at DC for the last few months too. So we had all the stories about, Henry Cavill coming back and going away and getting fired, but he's not fired. He's too old, even though he's like 38. He's not really that old if you think about it. He could conceivably still play a young Superman. But James Gunn was very adamant, even before this slate announcement, that his Superman would be a young Superman. And they announced coming out in July of 2025, his Superman movie, the real kickoff to the DCU, will be Superman Legacy. And it's a movie he's currently writing. They kind of hinted that he'll probably direct it. And that's going to feature young Superman. What I thought was really interesting, again, going back to the announcements, they specifically used artwork from Frank Quitely and Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman.
Yeah.
And so, I'm assuming, I don't know that James Gunn, did he make a big deal about the artwork that accompanied the announcement? Because everyone's assuming that they're drawing inspiration from the artwork that they're showing.
He did not. Mostly he just voiced his his fanboyness for All-Star Superman and for Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. I do think that there's definitely probably going to be some pulls from there. But if I'm going to be honest, I think really the most they talked about in terms of the story was this idea of Superman existing as kindness in a time when people scoff at kindness. And I think that really proves that he gets Superman, which I love. He stands for truth, justice, all that stuff. And, he's going to be that very righteous moral center that is missing from this universe, I think. So I think that's something, that optimism is something that we saw in All-Star Superman. If you guys had the chance to read that, it's a wonderful run. It is Elseworlds, which is oddly enough, they're pulling from Elseworlds to put into continuity. But that being said, it is a really optimistic, really bright story. And I think that they're probably going to go for that tone. But he didn't really explicitly say they're pulling from All-Star Superman, because I doubt there's going to be a cancer subplot. That's was central to All-Star Superman. But my guess is, as far as the tone and, how this is going to look and feel, I'm guessing that that's probably their inspiration.
I just hope that they cast maybe a more unknown actor versus someone who's already kind of established.
Huh.
Especially if they're trying to go younger.
Yeah.
Or someone who looks younger than Henry Cavill, because Henry Cavill doesn't look like he's about to turn 40. So you got to find someone who looks like at least then 10 years younger than Henry Cavill looks, I would say. So I don't know. I would like to see an unknown actor play it, kind of just like how Chris Hemsworth was virtually unknown when he got Thor, something like that.
I think the Superman announcement was very interesting. I had two major thoughts about it. One was, I believe one of James Gunn's major powers as a filmmaker is doing what I'll call kind of like a snark bro dude vibe, the funny dudes, basically. He does that very well. So it seems like to give himself the challenge of doing this sort of, straight edge, old fashioned, hopeful Superman story is an interesting challenge. And I think the odds mentioned it'd have to do his relationship with his family and his father. Another theme that Gunn comes back to a lot is, relationship with fucked up fathers. And that's where he gets the emotional core, the weight of a lot of these things he does. So I think it's a very interesting thing because, in our old fashioned idea of Superman, he's definitely the least bro-y. he makes the least witty comments. So there's that one thing just about his style. And I also wanted to pick up on Keith, you were saying I thought they were being very conscious about the art they were choosing to promote this unseen stuff, because it pulls more from the more recent era of the Morrison Superman and the Morrison Batman.
Yeah, Grant Morrison's got a big presence over the whole slate announcement.
Yes, Grant Morrison shadowed heavily on this other thing. We're pulling from more recent slates of the comic stories, which are less old-fashioned than traditional DC stories.
Honestly, I love that for once we're not just pulling from just Frank Miller or, the most well-known story that sold 1 million copies that everyone knows. We're actually pulling from real, authors and real storylines that were fantastic, but that might not be household names. That's what I love about people pulling from Grant Morrison, Tom King. I hope they pull from Scott Snyder's run of Swamp Thing in addition to Alan Moore's run, because Scott Snyder did some revolutionary things with Swamp Thing. Even Chip Zdarsky, who did a lot of the recent Batman runs, has been doing a good job. These amazing stories exist from these amazing authors that people don't know about. And the only thing that any director, whether it's Nolan or whether it's Snyder or whether it's even Burton, has thought to pull from is the most obvious one, which is
100%. And I've argued for years. I mean, as much as I love every incarnation of Batman that's appeared on big screens and small, they are very much in the vein of Frank Miller. And I think I wrote a post on the Nerds of Color many years ago that there were other comic book writers than Frank Miller who did Batman. And, if anything, I will give Nolan a little bit of credit because he does pull a little Denny O'Neil here, a little
Jeff Loeb. Yeah.
Right. So with Ra's al Ghul and everything. But it's still very much in the vein of year one and everything. So let's jump ahead a little bit because there were some other announcements in between. But since we're talking about Batman, I did want to mention the Brave and the Bold is the DCU's introduction, not only their Batman, but their Robin. We haven't seen Robin on screen since Chris O'Donnell. And it's going to be Damian Wayne. What's interesting is that, talking about the artwork informing the stories is that the artwork they use is very much Dick Grayson as Batman, but he was very clear that his Batman is Bruce Wayne, right?
Yes, correct. It's going to be a father-son story for sure.
So they just happen to use the Dick Batman artwork.
Yeah, the Batman
that confused
and Robin
me a little bit when I saw Batman and Son was very much led to Batman and Robin, which ended up being when Dick took over the cowl. But I'm assuming that the at least this first Brave and the Bold movie is going to be when Bruce finds out about Damian. I don't think Damian will even be Robin for a couple films.
I think it's definitely the Batman and Sons storyline that Grant Morrison did. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I want to say Detective Comics 6 something. I feel like they pulled this image just because it showcases how Damian Wayne actually was raised as an assassin and a
Little
murderer.
shit.
Yeah, he's like a little shit. And I think that Gunn loves that about him. So he really emphasized that.
Brittany, how do you feel about Robin coming back to the Batman universe as the one of the biggest defenders of Batman and Robin?
Look, that movie is everything, okay? Like, I love that movie. I don't know, I'm excited. Especially that maybe we might have, I don't know if they're gonna keep Damon Wayne being a person of color.
Well, they need to. I mean, shout
That
out to
would be
Swara, who I think he's even given some casting suggestions on Twitter. But Damian Wayne needs to be at the very least Mina or Swana, because he's the son of Talia al Ghul, who's the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, and Ra's al Ghul has been white in too many live action properties that we need to finally allow Ra's al Ghul to be a person of color, and therefore Damian being a person of color. So, because a lot of the casting suggestions people are throwing out there is all like skinny frail white boys, and it's like that's not Damian.
And I love
Timothy Chalamet is not Damian Wayne. Goddamn.
What?
No.
Someone suggested him.
He's also-
I saw what's his name from the Umbrella Academy.
But he's also
number
not a person
5.
of color. The Gallagher.
He's not.
Yeah.
But
Amy Gallagher.
I was just like, no, he's so white. I love the actor, but yeah, I always like a Batman and Robin story, so I'm excited for it.
Well, and the other exciting thing is he specifically said this is going to lead into a Bat family movie, right? Like we're getting
they're
the
going
whole
to be in
family.
this. They're definitely going to be in this movie.
Not just Batman. Right? We're going to get. I'm assuming since they're starting with Damian, we're going to live in a world in which Dick's already been established. He'll probably be Nightwing already. Maybe there'll be a Jason Todd. Maybe there'll be a Tim Drake. Hopefully there's a Cassandra Cain and a Barbara Gordon, like the whole fucking family. Now, this is where, going back to Brittany's thing about insisting on a younger Superman for the DCU, this is where I am kind of like, I do wish maybe Superman was. I know Mike has his issues about Henry Cavill. I'm not saying, we should keep Henry Cavill, but I think one reason that might have made sense to keep Henry Cavill is that Superman and Superman Legacy could be a little bit older, like in his late 30s, only because I feel like if Batman's already got a whole family, and Damian's especially there, I would love to see Superman in a place where he's already firmly established, not just, I know it's not an origin, but he's still young. I would like to see a little bit older Superman so that we could get the whole Superman marries Lois, and then they have Jonathan, and then in the future we'll get a Jonathan and Damian Super Sons movie. But the timing doesn't make sense now if, like, by the time Jonathan's born, Damian will be like in his 30s. So we'll never get like the Super Sons movie, which they could have done if they kept Cavill or at least kept an older Superman.
Whoa.
That said, Bat Fam, everyone's been so excited to finally see the Bat family on. That's why I think Batgirl being canceled was such a big deal, because that was like the closest thing to like other people other than Batman on screen. But if we're getting the whole Bat family, this might be the best Batman movie ever made.
Yeah,
It's really good that they're bringing back the Robin thing, just because Batman needs a relationship with some other people besides, his fucking butler. He's a uniquely flawed character that he's so isolated and so rich. And basically his human stuff happens with the butler. Whatever version of Robin it is brings out an interesting dimension of Batman. Again, the father-son thing, which James Gunn loves as a recurring theme. So,
and you can't have a more fucked up father than Batman.
Yeah.
You also can't have a more fucked up son than Damian.
Yeah. So that's.
And if you want to distinguish your Batman from the Elseworlds Batman, what better way than to bring in the whole Bat family?
Yeah, give him a family problem.
Yeah, I'm assuming he's not going to be like that brooding kind of like Christian Bale, Ben Affleck, Robert Pattinson take on Batman. And he may be a little bit, not that the Grant Morrison Batman is not happy-go-lucky either, but he's definitely, the Bat family Batman is not the Robert Pattinson, Christian Bale, Michael Keaton Batman, and that's how what better way to distinguish them than that,
The way that I really see it is, what is Batman if not a man that's trying to preserve innocence? Because he lost his when he was a kid. And that's the symbol of the Bat family. That's why the Bat family has to exist. It's because these people are people that he thinks he could save and help in the ways, or lost everything in the ways that he did. when you're dealing with a character that was raised as an assassin since he was born, and you have to instill innocence, or at least instill a sense of justice into this character that has no morality, that is a quintessentially perfect Batman tale to tell, because that's what Batman is. He's justice and he's morality, all in one. So to instill that in a murderer would be fantastic,
So let's jump back a little bit, and we'll talk about these three in tandem. There's going to be a Lanterns HBO Max series where Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart are basically teaming up as like a True Detective style terrestrial crime that they have to solve, which is interesting. There's also going to be a Booster Gold HBO Max series and a Paradise Lost HBO Max series. The Paradise Lost one sounds interesting because even though it's set on Themyscira, it's going to be a generation before Diana, and they're thinking of more of like a Game of Thrones style political intrigue where the Amazons came from type story.
Yeah, because Krypton was so good as a TV series. Sorry, I'm a little bit cynical about that way. I'm going to come right back. I'm getting
I'm a little wary about Paradise Lost, to be honest. Of the three, I feel like I'm most excited for Lanterns just because I feel like the whole True Detective meets Space Cop sounds really interesting. Booster Gold is always going to be a fun idea for a series. Paradise Lost is a little bit tricky for me because it's kind of they're like having their cake and eating it too, because interestingly they didn't announce a Wonder Woman project, right? There's clearly a Superman project, clearly a Batman project. Wonder Woman is the third part of that trinity, and there's this whole like, now I can see why Patty Jenkins was like, fuck y'all then, right? Because it's like, where's the Wonder Woman project? Paradise Lost is not a Wonder Woman project, right? And
Correct.
you can't kind of pass it off as one. Where's the one? Is it because they just don't know what to do with Gal? Is it because, like, I'm a little, and I feel like using the Game of Thrones analogy also kind of, I don't want to say rubs me the wrong way, but like, let's be honest. Like, when Game of Thrones was pitched, how was it pitched? It's Lord of the Rings with boobs, right? Like, remember all the sex position in Game of Thrones? And I'm like, do we want to take that route with the Amazons? You know what I mean? Is that how you want to pitch? Like,
right, because it's an HBO series.
Right, because it's an HBO series.
Oh my God.
I mean,
potential landmines.
I mean, it depends on who they get to run the show, but I just feel like the Game of Thrones pitch is a little tone deaf if you're talking about a Themyscira show. I feel. Maybe I'm wrong, because House of Dragons maybe was not as like seemingly not as exploitative as early seasons Game of Thrones, but it still wasn't great. In that regard.
Yeah, I stopped watching House of Dragon. Matt Smith was honestly the only good thing about that show, and you were supposed to be rooting for the other girl. I don't even remember her name. And I was just like, why can't Matt Smith just kill them all and just rule?
Because I mean, the other thing that gives me a little pause is that, and they didn't say they're going to go this route, but like the whole Brian Azzarello take on the Themyscirans was like very rapey. And again, if you're going to use the Game of Thrones analogy, I just hope they don't go the Azzarello route that like Zeus just raped everyone and that's where the Themyscirans came from. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like Dom said, potential landmines in the Paradise Lost story.
Well, there is a certain, white dude overseer, point of view from this whole slate, which I'm not going to over complain about that now, because it's too far in advance, but it is a dimension of it. But of course, we haven't talked about the Supergirl movie that they announced yet. I mean, Wonder Woman is in a weird place.
True.
I mean, as far as the cinematic franchise. But yes, all those points well taken. And remember one of those things, like just as simple as I'm speaking about your Game of Thrones analogy, like the costumes in Wonder Woman were like so well done, and then we got the Zack Snyder version of those, which was clearly Game of Thronesy titillating sexification of something they went out of their way to do in a more elegant way in the Jenkins Wonder Woman. I mean, so that's exactly the kind of thing that could happen.
Yeah,
because white dudes overseeing things, and
that's where we don't know.
And then
they didn't announce who the
know.
showrunner for Paradise Lost is.
My guess, it'd be really tone deaf if they didn't put a female showrunner in charge of something like this. To be honest, they really must. They really should.
So I mean, and that could allay a lot of the fears I have. But I just when I saw the Game of Thrones analogy, I was like, do we want to do that for a Wonder Woman show?
Well, they're just saying because Game of Thrones is super popular.
Right.
I think you're overanalyzing this. They're pumping their own HBO,
Yeah, for sure.
successes. But good point.
If they're smart, honestly, if Tom King, who is a comic book writer, is involved with a lot of this, you could put Gail Simone in charge of something like Paradise Lost. She'd do a pretty terrific job, and she knows the mythology really well.
Well, speaking of Tom King, the other two announcements we'll just quickly run through are the two more films. Well, there are three more films. There's a Swamp Thing film that Mike alluded to earlier that James Mangold, I think, is attached to. Like there was a tweet back and forth, and he's like posting pictures of Swamp Thing, and I think Variety had the story that he's in negotiations to direct Swamp Thing. There's also an Authority movie, which is another kind of like out of left field.
Oh my god, you saved the Authority thing for last. You guys are such total old school DC heads. The Authority thing is the most exciting thing.
It's the most exciting thing for me.
I'm joking around, but did you folks read the Authority or no?
Well, I'm familiar with. I mean, what we were talking about representation. Like the one thing about the Authority that's interesting is that like Apollo and Midnighter are probably the two most prominent LGBT superheroes.
Super gay couple.
Film.
And they're
right.
cool.
Like they're not only gay, but they're a couple. They're married.
Yeah.
But it's also like
they do rely on some tropes, but we can get into that when
Authority is very much in the vein of like The Boys, right? It's kind of like cynical superheroes, which is interesting to be in your like initial slate of like a rebooting the superhero franchise, and you're throwing in your cynical superheroes. That said, here's my like hot take: maybe they're the bad guys.
Yes,
sure.
That's exactly what I think. Because look, if you're pitching Superman as kindness in a
optimistic,
world of kindness, then who's going to fight the Authority? Who needs to stand up to the Authority? It's got to be Superman, and it's got to be these other heroes who actually do believe in a sense of morality and justice. A Batman that's trying to get a kid not to kill people. Supergirl, I'm not sure what his take is on that, or Swamp Thing, but yeah, you got to have this morality going up against these amoral characters. I think that has to be the big Apollo versus Superman kind of event that they're
Midnighter versus Batman.
That's a good setup.
And then you're right, you can't have like broody, violent Ben Affleck branding people Batman if you have the Midnighter in your universe, because that's his whole thing, right? Like Midnighter is like this brutal.
And you never should have had branding and killing Batman in the first place. That's just counter to what Batman is. So,
and I will say, I didn't save this for the last on purpose, but we keep talking about Tom King, and I do want to mention like there is as kind of per usual in like the way we build cinematic universes now, there is like a writer's room of people, and there it's a really fascinating combination of folks. James Gunn, of course, think of him as the Kevin Feige, the showrunner of this DC universe, like extended, television series. But part of his writer's room is Drew Goddard, who is connected to like X-Men films. He wrote Cloverfield and Cabin in the Woods. Like I believe he was connected to Daredevil at one point, wasn't he?
I believe.
Yes. He was showrunner for the first season.
Your favorite, Dominic, Christina Hodson, is part of the writer's room. She's the
thank goodness she's in there.
Flash, Birds of Prey, and the canceled Batgirl film. Also, Jeremy Carver, we mentioned earlier, he's the creator and showrunner of Doom Patrol. Christelle Henry, who was a producer and writer on Watchmen. They're both running the Waller show. And last but not least, my favorite comic book writer of this modern generation, Tom King, is part of the writer's room. And Tom King's Supergirl run from last year, like this was, we were talking about like, does the art represent the movie? James Gunn out and out said, this movie is based on Woman of Tomorrow. This movie is an adaptation of Woman of Tomorrow. Tom King is like part of it. So that's exciting. Like to your point about like, we never, like DC has always kind of avoided fully adapting like actual comic book storylines. Woman of Tomorrow is a very interesting take on Supergirl, and they're fully making that their Supergirl movie. What I do find interesting is that Supergirl is also a character in The Flash. There was no indication Sasha Calais is coming to play this version of Supergirl, right? Like they're going to recast probably.
We don't know. I mean, in my opinion, it's very possible that they could bring her back as well. But
I bet they want to see how that Flash goes over.
That's what I think as well.
I think that'll make a lot of decisions.
Yes, I think so too.
Can I add something about the writers? Just to what we're talking about. You're talking about the writers' room and how they're pulling from a more recent generation of beloved stories. Grant Morrison, Tom Kingster, who I think are great. Like when the news came out and it was about the Authority, I think was it Brian Hitch, who's one of the main artists on the Authority, tweeted that was like, oh, that's news to me. And I have no idea whether he meant that like funny or angry or both. I'm guessing a bit of both. But, Just as long as we're announcing massive slates, so to remind everyone that like it is good to respect the writers and artists who made this shit up, who now are going to turn into $100 billion movies. Like it's cool, like for us as fans to go, oh, that's my favorite comic. Let's just take it into movie. And let's remember the process is some writers and artists for Marvel and DC made the comics, and James Gunn read them, and he got in a position to spend $200 million on a movie. So I don't know. I'd like to see how this all plays out. I'd like to think it plays out with, continued respect and awareness for the people who made up what ended up being our favorite stories, and the stories that make us more excited about the DC universe than we were previously. Anyway.
Yeah, 100%. And if anything, like there seems to be some acknowledgement of that, at least on James Gunn's part. Right?
James Gunn has more of it than
anyone else, right? Like
anyone else, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no shade to Kevin Feige, but like, I don't think he's ever really come out and said like, shout out to, aside from maybe like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, like shout out to like, Ed Brubaker for the Winter Soldier. I mean, aside from like maybe casting, putting Jim Starlin in the movie for like a cameo or something.
And they do get compensated in some way. I'm not saying they don't get compensated, but it's very arguable whether they get compensated in proportion with.
But to have Tom King be part of like basically an executive producer of the DC universe, is probably the most acknowledgement a comic book writer has gotten in the building of any of these cinematic franchises.
Closest I could think of is maybe Fraction being a creative consultant on Hawkeye, and that's it. But yeah, there's not much else,
Yeah, and as David Aja was like kind of pissed off about like, you're using my artwork and you don't come to me for Hawkeye, that same Hawkeye. So
yeah,
here's the big $64,000 question. Dominic alluded to this earlier. This ain't the first time Warner Brothers and DC said, here's a slate of movies.
Yep.
Other than Superman, we have a July 2025 premiere date for that. Are these movies coming out? Like the thing about Warner Brothers that we know, they are a fickle bitch.
Yes.
They could sell Discovery, could sell Warner Brothers like tomorrow to Comcast or whoever, and this whole thing gets thrown out the window, right? Like over under, how confident are we that this slate actually manifests in the next couple of years? Or do we think, as per usual with DC, some sort of course correction happens? Not even a course correction, just like HBO Max, disintegrates and they have to merge with yet another. Nintendo fucking buys DC and we have Mario in the next cinematic universe. Like what? So what's the over under? This is for everyone. What is the over under that this actually happened?
I don't know. I want to keep faith because like I said, I've always enjoyed like at least DC animated stuff and all their older films when I was younger, and like some of the stuff now. So I'm hoping they get a win because, like, again, I'm tired of people always being like Marvel has the better characters when, I feel like, there's good characters from both sides and all that stuff. Not to both sides this thing, but, but so, yeah, I hope that there's a win for DC. But like you said, it's so fickle that you just can't have full faith that it's going to come to fruition. So I guess we'll just see in the next couple of years.
I'm pretty confident, actually. I'm about 80% confident. And there's a reason why. It has to do a lot with the structural changes that they've made here. DC Studios is its own separate studio now. Gunn and Safran are not reporting into anyone from the Warner Brothers side. One of the biggest issues really was you'd have these studio executives that didn't really know anything about comics, that just thought that they knew what appealed to specific audiences, really intervening and really destroying a lot of directors' work and creative vision that went inside the movies, for better or worse. Without that level of infrastructure commanding them, if Gunn and Safran are basically getting carte blanche and Superman's kind of kicking things off, I definitely think that Superman will be enough of, if it's good, will be enough of a good launching point for us to get into the Authority, and I think people would be very interested to see how this all evolves from there. That said, again, to your point, Keith, very fickle. Like Zaslav is a very fickle person, as we know, very much so from his behavior on things that get cut, things that don't get cut, things that get canceled, Batgirl being shelved. So I'm kind of torn between one executive's ego in promising all of these things and then ending up having to cancel them and look bad because of that, and his determination to prove to everyone that he might know best. I think that that's going to be the make it or break it for this. So he might stick to this even if things are not financially successful, just because he thinks he doesn't want to look bad, or he might shut it down because he likes shutting things down. It's fun for him. So
I mean,
there you go.
If it means you get a tax break by not releasing 8 of the projects that were announced last week,
yeah,
I feel like Zaslav would do that.
The good news is, according to Gunn, and let's see if they stick with this, but I've got confidence that Gunn will. They're not moving into production on anything without a completed script. That has to be the difference that he has. He says he's going to implement that other studios don't, and he would know because he's worked with, as we know, other studios that move forward with production on things without having a second act cleared. So they force the Illuminati in there for whatever reason. So yeah, I'm just going to put that out there.
Well said. I'm not confident, but that they'll all come out, but it's fine. But that's fine because, as you said earlier, Keith, continuity is the domain of nerds. It is a fun thing for us to think about. I'm just going to do a real world check here. We enjoy thinking about this whole slate. It's nice that they announced this whole slate. It gives the appearance of a plan. Person on the street does not care that in 3 years there is probably going to be a Brave and the Bold movie. Simply do not care about all this sequencing that we take to heart because we enjoy it. It gives us joy. So the point is, it gives us joy. That's fine. I think, again, on the real world, a lot is going to depend on how The Flash works out, because that movie has been through all kind of real world hell and is like ridiculousness. And again, it is not Batman or Superman. So Cam, the not Batman or Superman movie.
But it kind of is a Batman movie, but whatever.
Yes. But they had to get him in there so it could justify its case as a movie.
I mean, I'm surprised they don't just rename it Batman: The Flash.
Yeah, here's the basic. I mean, the DC thing, like if you're talking about why movies will happen or not, they're still making a case for the ones that are not Batman and Superman.
Right.
That's very basic.
Yeah, I mean, of the 4 projects coming out this year, right? I mean, aside from Michael Keaton's appearance, they're all, you're right, they're all solo movies not featuring either Superman or Batman. That's exciting.
It is exciting for us fans. But now that you brought it up, I'm so excited for the possibility that's leading to a Justice League versus Authority movie that now I'm extra invested in a way I wasn't when we began this conversation. So
well, that we did our job.
I think that would be a great place for it to end up.
Yeah, that is a great place. And we'll do a really quick what's nerd popping for everyone and then wrap up. We'll start with you, Brittany. What is nerd popping for you?
So for anyone who knows my music side of things, very exciting things are happening for me in my music. My favorite band ever is releasing a new album this year. As you know, Fall Out Boy. I'm really excited. I literally have spent $500 alone on Fall Out Boy this year.
Before their new album comes out? That's considerable.
I pre-ordered their album that comes with like a autographed like copy of the album and like a hoodie. And then I ordered, I got the guitarist Joe Troman's book that he wrote, and then I spent like almost $400 on their tickets. When they're here in LA, I got the second date because the Academy who is one of my favorite bands, who they don't really do music anymore, and they kind of just play shows every now and then just to like appease people who like them, but they usually just do it in the Midwest. So they're gonna be here in LA. That's very exciting. So Fall Out Boy, it's great. I'm really I'm happy.
No one can question Brittany's Fall Out Boy fandom. Dominic, what is nerd popping?
Oh, just a quick shout out to this comic book from Dark Horse called White Savior by the artist Eric Wen, which I read through and I'm going to write up on the site sometime, but because we're here talking about it, I would just mention it. It's a funny adventure spoof on the White Savior trope a la Last Samurai or The Great Wall. And it helps if you know the trope, and it helps that it also kind of comedic satiric take on these things. And more on that later.
Excellent.
Anyway, White Savior, Dark Horse.
Mike, as our special guest, you get the last word on nerd popping. What's nerd popping for you this week?
Yeah, so this week I'm going to have the opportunity to see a Giant movie coming up soon. I'm looking forward to potentially throwing a review on the site once the embargo drops. So I'm hoping that everyone will join me as the Quantumania of it all kind of, starts to explode and starts to get better. Yeah. So, yeah.
Very cool. We'll probably spend more time talking about this when the season is over, but as a non-gamer, I'm learning all of these things from The Last of Us by watching the show. We're recording before episode 4 drops, so I don't know what happens. I know that Mike, I think you've probably seen episode 4. That was probably part of the tranche you were given to review. I knew nothing about the game. I didn't even know it was a zombie game until I watched the show. So I can't say anything that hasn't already been said about episode 3, Frank and Bill, relationship goals, right? But anyone review bombing this show, get a life, because like it's literally the best show on television.
So good.
And
Here.
And again, as having no connection to the video game, shout out to Pedro Pascal. He just hosted Saturday Night Live last night, probably the best SNL of the season. I don't know if you've caught the Mario Kart Last of Us parody. If not, check that out on YouTube. So yeah, I mean, again, to promote Last of Us seems pretty like basic because everyone loves this show. But
I have a question. I missed your discussion of The Last of Us on the podcast, and as someone who's played the game one.
Well, we haven't really talked about it. I want to talk about it more in the future.
You haven't really talked about it. Okay. Here's a conceptual question before we get into any deep conversation, which could be later. As versus watch the show, not play the game, where you hard, fast, spoiler.
Yes, please don't spoil. Because
what happens in the game?
After watching
you're
the first
experiencing
episode,
it as a show.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I know nothing. Like I said, I didn't even know it was a zombie show until I watched the first episode. And because I thought Last of Us was like dystopian, post-apocalyptic. I didn't know it was zombies, right?
Yeah. And
I watched the first episode. I decided, well, let me watch one of those cinematics on YouTube. And then it was like, oh, this is too much. Let me stop. And I want to experience the show and then maybe go back and experience the game afterwards. So yeah, please don't spoil.
I'm in the minority not watching the show, but I can explain why later.
Yeah.
Show is great.
The show is amazing. Everyone,
I'm sure it is.
This podcast has been amazing. Mike Manalo, as our guest, I will give you the first opportunity to tell people how to find you on the internet.
Sounds good. You guys can find me at TidyBullBoy182 on Twitter and Instagram. But as always, my work and coverage is on The Nerds of Color with Keith and the rest of the staff and Dom and Brittany and everyone. Thank you guys so much for having me, by the way. This was amazing.
Hey, awesome. Great to talk with you.
Brittany, how can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Hive, even though I'm kind of not as active on Hive because I thought that was going to take off.
Does anyone use Hive? I mean, let's be real.
I don't know. At Hi Brittany Monet, and then my other podcast, Lituation Room, which is at Lit Room _podcast. I think I finally got the @ down.
That's what you did out on Christmas break was
I was memorizing it. And we finally recorded another episode where we talk about Black Adam, Black Panther, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So yeah.
Dominic?
I'm Dominic Ma at Dama DOMMAH on Instagram and Twitter.
You can find me on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow, and at @RealKeithChow on Instagram. Follow The Nerds of Color on all social media platforms at The Nerds of Color. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock family. Give us a rating and a review. If you do, subscribe to our videos at youtube.com/The Nerds of Color and support our channel at patreon.com/The Nerds of Color. Until next time, everybody.
Pedro Pascal is everything.
Pedro Pascal is daddy.
Yes.
Like literally, that's his whole deal. He's just everyone's dad.
No, that's true. That's his type. Nothing about that, except in that Wonder Woman 84 movie.
He was
somebody's daddy there.
Oh right, he was daddy in that too. You're right. That was the whole problem. Okay.